So today we're going to work on analogous blues. The color palette that we're going to work with is blue, red, and blue violet, and red violet. So analogous colors are those colors that's three colors that sit next to each other on the color wheel. I'll be using a cobalt blue on the left, Prussian blue is on the right. I'll mix it with a cool red, alizarin crimson, and then I will be using the colors blue, blue violet, and violet. So right now I'm putting down my violet and blue violet mixes with a mixture of the alizarin crimson. And you could do a series of tones and values with this color scheme. Okay, so as I start my painting, I'm going to put in a very light sketch with my round number 8 brush, and I'm just sketching in the big shapes very lightly. You of course can use a pencil if you prefer. I prefer to just stick with a very light wash because in the end it will all blend in. And this is just a quick study, a small sketch, roughly 6 by 6 inches. So right now I'm just blocking in with a very light wash the big shapes. And then I'll go in and block in some of those shadow shapes. As you can see, I can use the tip of the brush and with a little bit of water, the side of the brush to put in a field of wash. I'm going to keep my my light blue in the background. I'm going to keep the that mixture of cobalt blue is in the background, and I'm going to keep it soft and light. Cool colors will recede, and warm colors and high contrast colors will come to the foreground. And as you can see right now, I'm putting in that shadow that is behind the boat in the foreground. There are 3 fishing boats, and this is along the Fish Pier in Boston Harbor. And it's been operating for over 100 years. Okay, with just the tip of my number 8 round, I'm just sketching in the shape of that foreground fishing boat. I'm just indicating the reflections in the water. And I'll try to put in the structure of the boat. I'll work on the mast, the fish derrick, the bridge, the cabin, and the radar antenna, which is on the mast. And all those structural lines will help to define the planes and the shape of the fishing boat. And right now I'm putting in the shadow that is a doorway into the cabin. And I'm going to keep the cabin and the navigational bridge white and light. I will go in with very light tones toward the end of the painting and put more details in the foreground boat. But for now I'm just focusing on the big shapes. What are the big shapes and what is the structure I need to put in. I'm just putting in the shadows that indicate the windows and the navigation bridge just above the cabin. And just indications of where the reflections of the water will go. So I'm just using small marks just to describe the scene. And keep in mind, these are just very small abstract shapes. That's how I like to work with paint, is to just uh, break the image area, whether you're working from life or whether you're working from a photo. You're just breaking everything down into simple shapes, simple abstract shapes, and then you pull it all together. Once you put all those shapes together, you come up with a scene. So right now I'm going to put a wash. I'm going to do wet on wet. So I'm putting in that just some water with a 3/4 inch flat brush, and just by putting the water in and letting the watercolor paper absorb it, then I'll go in with some paint, and that will help to create a soft wash in the background for that background building that's along the wharf. You can always use the edge of your flat brush or angled brush to create crisp edges, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to create a crisp edge where the boat meets the water and some reflections in the water. So in this exercise, you can see the difference between using a round brush and a flat brush. So the light that is reflected from the sky is hitting the left side of the boat, and the back ends of the boats are in shadow. So my goal is to really depict that plane change, the left edge of the boat, and as compared to the back end of the boat. So as you can see, I'm going in with the left edge, and it's a lighter wash, and I'll keep the back end of the boat, that plane, darker. And I'll redefine some of the key structural parts of the boat later with some midtones. As you put your abstract shapes into your painting, you may find that you have to go in and restate some key features. Currently, I'm just restating the bracket pull that's used to roll up the nets. I think that's it's a very distinct characteristic. That and the fish derrick and the antenna, those are very strong characteristics in a fishing boat. So I'm making sure that I place those features in just very loosely with the tip of my 8 round brush. Now I'm actually drawing the top of the navigational bridge. So there's a cabin right in and on that boat. And I'm just putting those little details in there. An antenna going up in the front. And just keep your strokes loose and light. And check your edges. I'm looking really close to the edge of the back end of the fishing boats and then the reflection in the water. Now you can see that I'm creating perspective. So the reflections of the water are getting smaller, the boats are getting smaller as they recede into space. And I'll bring up the antenna on the foreground boat. So you want your objects to get smaller and lighter as they go to the background, and the objects in the foreground are going to be larger, and there's going to be more contrast and more detail. I'm going to keep the objects in the background and the midground pretty loose and not too much detail, and I'll focus on more detail and more contrast in the foreground. Right now I'm just using the shadow of, there's a truck on the pier that's collecting the fish, and that's the back end of the truck. I'm allowing that dark shape to define the front edge of the fishing boat in the foreground. And with that building in the background, I'm just going to do a very light, soft indication of windows. You don't have to be too detailed, just put in very simple shapes. This building has a nice structure on top, nice detail on top. You can be very simple, don't worry about getting too detailed, and I'm trying to keep it light. I'm trying to keep that building in the background. The value is going to be lighter than the boats and the reflections of the boat. So I'm going to go in and lighten those up a bit. I don't want it to stand out too much. Always keeping in mind, what is your focal point? Where do you want your viewer to be drawn? And you don't want to compete with that. So I decided the windows in that background building were competing too much with the foreground boat. So I lightened them up a bit. So a lot of the painting has dried, and now I'm going in with what you call a glaze. I'm using a very, very light wash of the Prussian blue, and I'm just going in with a light glaze. Actually, I'm using a mixture of the ultramarine blue with a little bit of the alizarin to keep that foreground warm. I'm keeping my shapes very simple in the background, just a simple indication. No need for details in the background. And then once I have all my large structures in, I'll begin to go in and just work on the details and the value in the foreground boat. Now I do have some Chinese white, so for any areas, eventually I will go in and put the name of that boat. It's the Atlantic Princess, the Atlantic Prince, and I'm going to put that in very lightly on that dark shape, the back end of the boat. I'm going in with some mid-tone values just to indicate lines, poles, nets, activity going on in that foreground boat. You can see as I'm making some dark lines to reinforce the structure and the shape of the bottom of the boat. There's just some activity going on outside the cabin. I'll unify that cabin with a wash. As you could see, with some midtones, I went in and added some detail in that foreground boat, and I also added some little spots of white, Chinese white, to get a little bit more detail in there.